In a world obsessed with monsters, the most lethal weapon isn't the one roaring at the top of the mountain. It's the one quietly clearing your table. The Gilded Lily wasn't just a restaurant. It was a cathedral built for the untouchable. Billionaires laundered reputations over bluefin tuna, and senators traded favors in the steam of oolong tea. It was where men like Jang Musa came to forget that their thrones were built on bone and ash. To the patrons, the girl in the apron was just part of the scenery, a shadow in a white shirt. They never noticed her eyes were scanning the exits, or that her hands were callous from triggers, not trays. They thought they were the predators in the room. They were wrong. Before the story begins, take a second to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. The transition from elegance to slaughter took less than 3 seconds. As the suppressors hissed and the heavy oak doors of the Gilded Lily were kicked off their hinges, Jang Musuk didn't reach for his gun. He sat paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of it. His security team, men he had handpicked for their ruthlessness, were collapsing like marionettes with their strings cut. The jazz music was still playing, a haunting saxophone solo that seemed to mock the red spray painting the white linen tablecloths. In the center of the chaos stood Alara. She didn't scream. She didn't drop her tray. Instead, she pivoted. The heavy silver platter, once carrying a $400 bottle of scotch, became a blurred disk of kinetic energy. As the first masked operative leveled his submachine gun at Musuk's chest, Alara swung the tray with a sickening crunch against the man's temple. Before he hit the floor, she had already closed the distance to the second shooter. Her movement wasn't the frantic flailing of a terrified waitress. It was the calculated economy of motion grace of a predator. She drove a steak knife upward, finding the narrow gap between the assassin's tactical vest and his jaw. "Get down," she barked. The voice didn't belong to the girl who had spent all evening politely refilling water glasses. It was a command that carried the weight of a battlefield, vibrating with a cold, terrifying authority. Musuk dived behind the overturned mahogany table just as a hail of gunfire shredded the upholstery above his head. He looked up, his eyes wide, and saw Alara crouched beside him. She was already stripping a sidearm from a dead man's holster with a practiced, fluid motion. She checked the chamber, slapped the magazine home, and glanced at him. Her eyes were different. The warmth of service had been replaced by a 1,000-yard stare that saw through the walls, through the smoke, and through him. "Stay on my heels," she whispered, her voice low and steady despite the thunder of boots approaching from the kitchen. "If you fall behind, you die. Understood?" Musuk, a man who had commanded thousands in the streets of Seoul, found himself nodding like a subordinate. "Who are you? Right now? I'm the only reason you're still breathing," she snapped. She didn't wait for a response. Alara moved. She went low, using the shadows of the flickering chandeliers. When the next wave of janitors moved through the wreckage, she didn't engage them in a shootout. She hunted them. She moved with a terrifying silence, appearing behind a gunman in the service corridor like a vengeful spirit, her blade working with surgical precision. Musuk watched her work, the realization chilling his blood. He knew the difference between a brawler and a ghost. This woman wasn't just trained, she was forged. She cleared the path to the service exit not with luck, but with a tactical map of the restaurant burned into her brain. She knew every blind spot, every creaking floorboard, and every tactical vulnerability of the men hunting them. They burst out into the freezing New York rain in the alleyway behind the restaurant. The neon sign of the Gilded Lily buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pink glow on the blood-stained white of Alara's apron. She didn't stop to catch her breath. She shoved Musuk toward an unassuming black sedan parked near the trash bins. "Key," she demanded, holding out a hand. It's a dead man's car. My driver is back there," Musuk managed to say, gesturing toward the restaurant. Alara didn't blink. She smashed the driver's side window with the butt of her captured pistol, reached inside, and ripped the plastic casing from the steering column. Within seconds, the engine roared to life. Musuk scrambled into the passenger seat as she slammed the car into reverse. As they peeled out of the alley, the janitor squad poured out of the exit, their rifles lighting up the dark with muzzle flashes. Alara drove with one hand, the other firing back through the shattered window with a rhythmic, disciplined cadence that suppressed the attackers long enough for them to round the corner. The adrenaline began to ebb, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence as they sped into the labyrinth of the city. Musuk adjusted his suit jacket, trying to reclaim some shred of his shattered dignity. He looked at the woman beside him. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her face a mask of cold iron. That wasn't the work of a waitress, Musuk said, his voice finally regaining its gravelly edge. I've seen Delta. I've seen the NIS. You move like a ghost I was told didn't exist. Alara didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the rearview mirror, watching for the headlights of the inevitable pursuit. The ghost is dead, Mr. Jang. You're sitting next to a waitress who wants to keep her job. But since your friends just turned my workplace into a morgue, I suppose we're both unemployed. Musuk leaned back, his eyes narrowing. He saw the way her hand trembled, not from fear, but from the sudden violent reawakening of a part of her soul she had tried to bury. He recognized that look. It was the look of a weapon that had been unsheathed after a decade in the dark. You saved my life, he said quietly. Don't thank me yet, Alara replied, taking a sharp turn into a darkened parking garage. They know who I am now, which means they won't stop until we're both in the ground. You wanted a steak dinner, Jang. You got a war instead. The black sedan screeched into the shadow of a rusted overpass, the engine ticking as the heat of the high-speed escape met the biting New York air. Alara didn't turn the car off. She let it idle, her eyes darting from the side mirrors to the dark periphery of the industrial park. Beside her, Jang Musuk was a study in controlled fury. He straightened his silk tie, his chest heaving slightly, the diamond on his pinky ring catching the stray light of a flickering street lamp. My safe house is in Queens, Musuk said, his voice regaining the resonant, commanding bass of a man who owned the horizon. Drive. My men will meet us there, and we will begin the retaliation. Alara didn't move. She stared straight ahead, her hands still gripped tight on the wheel. Your safe house is a graveyard. Your men are either dead or the ones who leaked your coordinates. If they knew you were at the Gilded Lily, they know where you sleep. Musuk turned his head slowly, his jaw set. The neck tattoo, a stylized tiger winding through black ink, seemed to pulse with his anger. I do not take tactical advice from someone who serves appetizers, Miss Brooks. You are a remarkable find, but do not mistake a moment of shared survival for a change in rank. You will drive to Queens. Alara finally turned. The coldness in her eyes didn't just meet his gaze. It dissected it. In that restaurant you were a god. Out here you're a liability. You're wearing a suit that costs more than this car and smells like expensive bourbon and failure. To the people hunting us, you're a lighthouse in a storm. She reached over, killed the engine, and pulled a tattered bag from under the seat. A go-bag she had kept hidden in the trunk of her personal car for 3 years, praying she'd never need it. She stepped out into the rain and didn't look back to see if he was following. Musuk hesitated, the indignity of the moment warring with the stark reality of the blood drying on his shirt. He stepped out, his Italian leather shoes splashing into a greasy puddle. They walked 2 blocks in silence before Alara stopped at a neon-lit wreck of a building, the Starlight Motor Inn. It was the kind of place where questions were never asked because the answers were usually illegal. The air inside the lobby smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner. Alara paid in cash, her movements clinical, while Musuk stood by the vending machine, looking like a displaced king in a gutter. Once the door to room 214 clicked shut, the tension snapped. Musuk paced the cramped space, his presence making the walls feel like they were closing in. He pulled a burner phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the keys. I need to call the council. If the White Tiger Syndicate thinks I am dead, the streets will burn by morning. I must command the transition. Put the phone down, Alara said. She was already stripping off her blood-stained white shirt, revealing a black tactical tank top and arms defined by the kind of lean functional muscle that only comes from years of specialized lethality. You forget yourself, Musuk hissed, stepping into her personal space. He was taller, broader, radiating a lethal confidence that had broken lesser men. I am the chairman. I do not hide in flea-bitten rooms while my empire is at stake. You will give me that phone or... Alara didn't flinch. In one motion she closed the gap, her hand catching his wrist while her other palm hovered an inch from his throat. It wasn't a strike, it was a demonstration. Or what, Jang? She whispered, her voice like a razor on velvet. You'll fire me? You'll have me killed? Look at me. Truly look at me. Musuk froze. Up close he could see the faint, jagged scar running behind her ear. The mark of a high-velocity fragment. He saw the way her weight was distributed, perfectly balanced, ready to snap his radius before he could even clench his fist. For the first time in 20 years, Jang Musuk felt the primal chill of being outmatched. Rule number 1, Alara said, releasing his wrist but not stepping back. I am the one who stays invisible. That means no phones. No counsel. No calls to your mistress or your lieutenants. The moment you ping a tower, a janitor squad is going to put a thermite charge through this door. Musuk lowered his hand, his expression unreadable, though a flicker of genuine curiosity crossed his features. And rule number 2? You aren't the chairman here. You're a John who's had a very bad night. You do what I say when I say it. You eat what I give you. You sleep when I tell you. I'm not protecting your empire, Jang. I'm protecting your life. There's a difference. Musuk looked at the sagging bed, then back at the woman who had just dismantled his ego with the same precision she had used on the hit squad. He let out a short, dry laugh, a sound devoid of mirth but heavy with respect. You speak of janitors, he said, sitting on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning under his weight. That is a term used by the Shadow Division of the UN. They are ghosts. You move like them. You think like them. Alara turned away, opening her bag to check the slide on her captured pistol. The division doesn't exist. And neither do I. The girl who served me my kimchi jjigae 2 hours ago. She had a kindness in her eyes, Musuk said quietly, his gaze fixed on her back. Where is she? Alara felt the familiar ache in her chest, the weight of the normal life she had tried to build, now crumbling like ash. She looked at her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. The waitress was gone. In her place was a weapon that had been polished and reloaded. She died when the first shot was fired, Alara replied, her voice flat. Get some sleep, Chairman. Tomorrow the world is going to look for both of us. We need to be ready to hit back. Musuk watched her as she took her post by the window, peering through a slit in the heavy curtains. He realized then that he wasn't just in a hiding spot. He was in the company of a creature more dangerous than any assassin his rivals could send. I have spent my life looking for a sword that wouldn't break, he murmured to the shadows. I didn't expect to find it holding a serving tray. Alara didn't answer. She just watched the street, waiting for the first sign of a headlight that lingered too long. The morning sun didn't rise over New York. It bled through a thick charcoal haze of smog and rain. By 6 a.m. the city was a hornet's nest. From the window of room 214, Alara watched the digital pulse of the street. It wasn't just the black and whites with their sirens screaming toward the Gilded Lily. It was the unmarked SUVs with tinted glass idling at intersections, and the delivery bikes circling the block with a frequency that suggested they were mapping a grid, not dropping off food. The word was out. The tiger was wounded, and the scent of blood had brought every scavenger in the 5 boroughs to the surface. The precinct on 4th Street is on the syndicate's payroll, Musuk said, standing behind her. He had shed his suit jacket, his silk shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the jagged scars of a dozen power struggles. If the police find us, they won't take us to a cell. They'll take us to a basement. I know, Alara replied, not turning around. And the triads in Chinatown are moving their hitters into Midtown. Your council didn't just try to kill you. They put a bounty on your head that's turned the city into a free-fire zone. She stepped away from the window and grabbed a roll of duct tape and a handheld radio she'd modified with a soldering iron from her bag. To survive the next 12 hours, she couldn't rely on modern tech. The janitors and the corrupt precincts used signal pings and facial recognition. To stay alive, they had to go analog. They had to go old world. Strip the bed, she commanded. Musuk bristled, his predatory instinct clashing with her bluntness. Excuse me. The sheets. Now. And the curtains. Alara was already moving, dismantling the room's cheap coffee maker to salvage the heating element. We're leaving a trail, but not the one they expect. Musuk watched in grim fascination as she worked. She wasn't just preparing to run. She was setting a ghost trap. She used the copper wiring from the electronics and the chemical cleaning supplies from the bathroom to create a crude but effective localized jammer. She taped the sheets over the mirrors to prevent any stray light glints from catching the eyes of snipers who might be perched on the warehouse across the street. When they moved, they didn't go through the lobby. Alara led him into the service crawl space, a humid, claustrophobic tunnel of pipes and rats. This was the old world, the veins of the city where high-altitude drones and satellite sweeps couldn't reach. Stay low and breathe shallow, she whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the dark. As they emerged into a damp alley 3 blocks away, the atmosphere of the city felt different. The air was thick with the tension of a standoff. At the end of the block, a squad of men in tactical gear, not police but private contractors, were tossing a civilian's car, looking for a man in a $5,000 suit and a waitress with a 1,000-yard stare. Alara pulled a drab, oversized canvas jacket from a dumpster and threw it at Musuk. Put it on. Hunch your shoulders. You're not a chairman, you're a ghost. They moved through the city like shadows passing through a forest. Alara used dead reckoning navigation, avoiding every traffic camera and doorbell lens. She led him through the kitchens of greasy diners, through the steam-filled basements of laundromats, and across the rusted catwalks of the subway lines. Every time Musuk tried to stand tall, to assert the dominance that was his birthright, Alara's hand was on his shoulder, pressing him down, forcing him into the grime. At a crowded transit hub, the danger spiked. A group of men in leather jackets, scouts for a local gang, were checking the faces of everyone entering the station. One of them, a scarred kid with a radio, locked eyes with Musuk. The recognition was instant. The kid reached for his waistband. Before he could draw, Alara was there. She didn't use a gun. A gunshot would be a flare in the dark. She used a heavy brass key wrapped in a handkerchief. One strike to the temple, silent and clinical. As the scout slumped, she caught him, easing him onto a bench as if he were a sleeping friend. Keep walking, she hissed to Musuk. You could have finished him, Musuk noted, his voice low as they slipped into a crowd of commuters. He saw us. He will tell them. If I kill everyone who looks at us, we leave a trail of bodies. Bodies get reported. Bodies bring the janitors, she replied. In my world, silence is more lethal than a bullet. If you want to survive the night, you have to learn to be small. Musuk looked at her, truly seeing the exhaustion behind her cold professionalism. He saw the way she checked her 6 every 10 paces, the way her ears twitched at the sound of a distant siren. He realized that this wasn't just training for her, it was a burden. She was carrying the weight of both their lives on shoulders that had been forced to be strong for too long. They reached a derelict shipyard on the edge of the water, a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and salt-cracked concrete. This was the fringe, the place where the city's law ended and the shadows began. We wait here until the shift changes, Alara said, dropping her bag against a container. She looked at her hands. They were covered in a film of city soot and the scout's blood. Musuk sat across from her, the heavy canvas jacket looking absurd over his tailored trousers. He looked at the water, then at her. The men hunting us. They think they are the apex predators. But they are hunting a ghost who knows the terrain better than the god who built it. They aren't hunting a ghost, Jang, Alara said, finally letting a sliver of emotion crack her voice. They're hunting a girl who just wanted to forget how to kill. The sound of a helicopter thrummed in the distance, its searchlight cutting through the rain like a white blade. They were trapped between a burning empire and a rising tide, and the water was only getting deeper. The interior of the shipping container smelled of brine and old iron. Outside, the rain lashed against the metal walls with a rhythmic, hollow thrum, isolating them in a small, windowless universe. Alara had improvised a lamp from a battery and a plastic water bottle, filling the space with a soft, diffused glow that carved deep shadows into the corners of the small room. Musuk sat on a crate, his silk shirt discarded. A jagged graze from a 5.56 round ran across his shoulder, a parting gift from the restaurant. The wound was ugly, the edges frayed and angry. Alara moved with the practiced stillness of a field medic. She had a needle and specialized nylon thread from her kit, her movements devoid of the hesitation that usually accompanies the sight of torn flesh. As she leaned in to clean the wound, Musuk winced, his body tensing instinctively. "Stay still," she murmured. "I've done this in the back of moving Humvees and in mud pits in the Congo. A shipyard in Brooklyn is a luxury." Musuk forced his muscles to relax, his eyes fixed on her face. Up close, without the mask of the waitress or the focus of the fighter, she looked human and exhausted. He traced the lines of tension around her mouth, then shifted his gaze to her own arms, where a thin silvery scar wound around her forearm like a serpent. "You have many maps on your skin, Miss Brooks," he said, his voice a low gravel in the quiet. "More than a waitress should have earned." Alara didn't look up. She pushed the needle through his skin, her hand steady. "Scars aren't maps. They're just reminders of mistakes. Moments I wasn't fast enough, or moments I was too slow to realize I was being used." "Is that why you left?" he asked. "The use of you?" Alara paused for a heartbeat, the thread taut between her fingers. She looked at the wound, then finally met his eyes. "I was part of a unit that didn't exist. We were the cleanup for things the government couldn't admit to breaking. For years I told myself I was the sword of justice. Then came a village on the border of a country I can't name. We were told it was a rebel stronghold. It wasn't." She resumed stitching, her voice dropping an octave. "It was just a village. I realized then that I wasn't a hero. I was a tool in the hands of men who didn't care about the blood, as long as the paperwork stayed clean. I walked away. I let them think I died in a helicopter crash in the Atlantic. I just wanted to serve coffee and never have to decide who lived or died ever again." She knotted the thread and snipped it with a pair of shears. "But the world doesn't like it when tools go missing." Musuk looked down at the neat, professional stitches. He ran a hand over his chest, touching a faint puckered mark near his heart. "A bullet hole from 20 years ago. I understand the weight of the tool," he said softly. "People look at me and see a king. They see the cars, the suits, the fear in the eyes of my enemies. They think the throne is built of gold." He let out a bitter, dry chuckle. "It is built of glass. And it is very, very cold." He leaned back against the rusted wall, the diamond on his finger reflecting the dim light. "I have thousands of men who would die for me, but not one who would sit with me like this. To be a chairman is to be a target for your enemies, and a stepping stone for your friends. My own council, men I fed, men I protected for decades, tried to erase me tonight because I became more valuable as a martyr than a leader." He looked at Alara, a strange, somber kinship forming in the silence. "We are the same, you and I. We are both monsters who tried to pretend we were men and women. We both live in the shadows because the light shows too much of what we've become." Alara packed her kit, her fingers lingering on the cold metal of her pistol. "I'm not a monster, Jang. I'm a survivor. There's a difference." "Is there?" Musuk challenged gently. "You moved through that restaurant like a storm. You didn't think. You didn't hesitate. You were home in the violence. That is the tragedy of people like us. We find our peace in the war." Alara didn't answer. She stood up and walked to the door of the container, pressing her ear against the cold steel. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. The distant sound of a siren wailed, a lonely cry in the concrete desert. "The janitors won't stop," she said, changing the subject. "They've failed twice now. That means they'll stop being surgical and start being loud. They'll look for your weaknesses." Musuk's expression hardened, the vulnerability of the last 10 minutes vanishing behind a wall of granite. "I have no family left. No children. No wife. My only weakness is my pride." "Then we use that," Alara said, turning back to him. Her eyes were sharp again, the ghost reassembling itself. They think they're hunting a wounded tiger and a scared waitress. We're going to show them that we're the ones doing the hunting. Musuk stood up, his towering frame nearly touching the ceiling of the container. He didn't ask for a phone this time. He didn't demand to go to Queens. He simply stood beside her, two ghosts in a rusted box, waiting for the world to come for them. I have spent my life making people bow, Musuk said, looking at the door. But for the first time, I think I would rather have someone who stands level with me. Alara checked the magazine of her weapon, the metallic click echoing in the small space. Don't get sentimental, Chairman. We still have to get through the night. The night is where tigers thrive, he replied. The vibration of the burner phone on the metal crate sounded like a chainsaw in the dead air of the shipyard. Musuk reached for it, but Ilara's hand was faster, pinning his wrist. She didn't speak. She held a handheld frequency scanner to the device, watching the spikes on the small LCD screen. The signal was encrypted, bouncing off 3 different proxy servers before hitting the phone. It was professional, but it was also loud, too eager to be found. It's Ji-hoon, Musuk whispered, his eyes dark with a mix of hope and suspicion. My second. He's been my shadow since the Busan docks. If anyone is left alive in the syndicate, it's him. Ilara let go of his wrist but kept her hand on her holster. He's calling a man who is supposed to be a ghost. How did he get this number? The emergency line, Musuk said, pressing the receiver to his ear. The voice on the other end was frantic, the sound of heavy rain and distant sirens bleeding through the speaker. Chairman? Praise the gods. We thought you were lost at the Lily. The council has declared a state of succession. They're purging the loyalists. I have a secure extraction team at the Grand Central Transition Tunnel. We have a path to the coast. You have to move now. Musuk looked at Ilara. She was already shaking her head, her eyes scanning the shadows outside the shipping container. But the chairman's jaw was set. The pull of his empire, the need to see a friendly face in a city of assassins, was a gravity he couldn't escape. 20 minutes, Ji-hoon, Musuk said, then crushed the phone under his heel. It's a Judas kiss, Ilara said, her voice a cold lash. He didn't ask if you were hurt. He didn't ask who was with you. He gave you a location with no exits. That's not an extraction, Jang. That's a kill box. He is my brother, Musuk countered, though the conviction in his voice was fraying at the edges. If I cannot trust him, then there is nothing left to go back to. Then we go, Ilara said, her tone shifting from protest to tactical preparation. But we don't go as guests. We go as the threat. The Grand Central Transition Tunnel was a sprawling, subterranean cathedral of marble and grime, echoing with the rhythmic thunder of subway trains and the frantic shuffle of commuters. It was the perfect place to hide a murder. Too much noise, too many witnesses who wouldn't dare look up from their phones. They moved through the mezzanine, Ilara 3 paces behind Musuk. She had forced him to trade his tailored shirt for a hooded sweatshirt, but he still walked with the unmistakable carriage of a man used to being followed. As they approached the designated pillar, Ilara's combat brain began to scream. The air was too still. The buskers were gone. A janitor in the distance was buffing the same patch of floor he'd cleared 5 minutes ago. Stop! Ilara whispered into the comlink in Musuk's ear. In the shadows of the upper gallery, a mile away but feeling like an inch, a lens caught a stray glint of light. Down! Ilara lunged, her shoulder slamming into Musuk's back just as a high-velocity round shattered the marble pillar where his head had been a microsecond before. The crack of the rifle was swallowed by the roar of an arriving 4 train, but the screams of the commuters were unmistakable. Pandemonium erupted. The crowd became a panic tide, surging toward the exits. Ilara didn't run with them. She dragged Musuk behind a heavy steel electrical housing, her eyes locked on the rafters. Ji-hoon is here, Musuk hissed, his face contorted in a mask of grief and fury. He looked across the mezzanine and saw him, his lieutenant standing calmly by the glass elevators, flanked by 4 men in tactical windbreakers. Ji-hoon wasn't looking for a survivor. He was watching the snipers perch, waiting for the confirmation of a kill. "He's not alone," Ilara said. She pulled a compact smoke grenade from her belt, a relic from her SF days. "The sniper is at 10 o'clock elevated. There's a second team moving through the turnstiles. They're flanking us." She popped the pin and rolled the canister. Thick, gray phosphorus smoke began to fill the mezzanine, turning the grand hall into a ghostly labyrinth. "Stay low. Count the shots," Ilara commanded. Crack. Another round sparked off the steel housing. Ilara stood, not with fear, but with the terrifying fluidity of a Tier 1 operator. She used the smoke as a shroud, moving through the panic like a shark in bloodied water. She didn't fire at the men on the ground. She looked for the eye in the sky. She spotted the glint again. A professional, perched on the maintenance catwalk. She didn't aim, she felt the shot. She fired twice. The silenced pops of her captured handgun were nothing compared to the sound of a body hitting the marble floor 60 feet below. "One down," she whispered. But the flanking team was closing in. Ji-hoon's men were suppressed, but they were disciplined. They began to fire into the smoke, blind but heavy. Ilara grabbed Musuk by the collar, dragging him toward the edge of the platform. "We have to take the tracks." "Ji-hoon!" Musuk roared, his voice echoing through the tunnel, raw and broken. "Look at me." Across the smoke the lieutenant froze. He saw the chairman, bleeding, disheveled, but still standing like a mountain. For a second the old loyalty flickered in Ji-hoon's eyes, replaced instantly by the cold realization that there was no turning back now. He raised his weapon. Ilara didn't give him the chance. She shoved Musuk off the platform just as a train's headlights rounded the bend. They hit the gravel of the tracks, the wind of the approaching express screaming past them. They rolled into the narrow dead space beneath the platform lip as the train roared by, a wall of steel and light separating them from the men who had betrayed them. In the strobe light flashes of the passing windows, Musuk saw Ilara's face. She wasn't looking at the train. She was looking at him, her hand gripping his arm so hard her knuckles were white. "Now you know," she said, the roar of the train swallowing her words for anyone but him. "The throne is gone, Jang. There's only the war now." As the last car rattled past, the mezzanine was empty, save for the smoke and the cooling body of the sniper. Ji-hoon was gone, but the message was clear. There were no brothers left. There was only the girl in the blood-stained apron and the man who had lost everything but his life. Musuk stood up in the darkness of the tunnel, the soot of the tracks coating his face like war paint. He didn't look back at the platform. He looked into the blackness of the tunnel ahead. "Then let the war begin," he said. The darkness of the subway tunnels eventually gave way to the skeletal remains of an abandoned cold storage warehouse in Red Hook. The air here was different, thick with the scent of salt, rust, and the heavy metallic tang of an approaching storm. They were running on fumes. Ilara's gait had changed. The soft, rhythmic step of the waitress was gone, replaced by a heavy-heeled, predatory stride that ignored the exhaustion clawing at her joints. Musuk followed her in a daze of hollowed-out rage. His tailored trousers were torn at the knee, and his white shirt was a roadmap of grease and soot. He looked at his hands, the hands that had signed treaties and ordered executions, and saw they were shaking. Not from fear, but from the sudden terrifying vacuum of his own power. "In there," Ilara muttered, gesturing toward a heavy steel door reinforced with a keypad that looked like it belonged in a bunker, not a warehouse. The room inside was a sharp, clinical contrast to the decay outside. It was a concrete box, no larger than a walk-in closet, lit by the hum of a single flickering fluorescent bulb. There were no chairs, no comforts. Just a workbench and a series of heavy, locked pelican cases stacked against the far wall. Ilara didn't offer him a seat. She went straight to the cases. The click of the heavy-duty latches echoed like a gunshot. "You said the ghost was dead," Musuk said, watching her as she began to strip. She pulled off the ruined tank top, her back a tapestry of scars and muscle, and replaced it with a Kevlar-lined tactical vest. She didn't look like a woman in a room. She looked like a weapon being reassembled. "I lied," she replied, her voice devoid of its earlier warmth. The waitress was the lie. This is the truth. She opened the next case. Inside, cradled in custom-cut foam, lay the tools of a trade that required no name. She pulled out a customized short-stroke carbine, its matte black finish absorbing the dim light. She checked the bolt, her fingers moving with a terrifying subconscious speed. Then came the sidearms, 2 high-capacity pistols, a series of serrated combat knives, and a row of flashbangs that looked like silver eggs of destruction. Musuk stepped closer, the weight of the hardware changing the atmosphere of the room. You kept all of this, even while you were pouring coffee for tourists. I kept it because I knew the world wouldn't let me stay gone, Elara said. She slapped a fresh magazine into the carbine, the metallic clack slide echoing with finality. She turned to face him, and Musuk felt a cold shiver go down his spine. The woman who had stitched his wounds with a trembling lip was gone. Her eyes were flat, twin pools of obsidian that saw the world in sectors and fire rates. The janitors are coming here, Jang. Ji-hoon knows I'm a professional now, which means he stopped playing mobster and started playing soldier. He'll bring everyone. Good, Musuk said, his own voice hardening into a blade. Let them come. I want to see the light leave his eyes. Elara reached into a smaller box and pulled out a heavy dark coat. She tossed it to him, followed by a tactical belt and a handgun she'd been calibrating. You know how to use this? Musuk gripped the weapon. It was heavier than the decorative pistols his guards usually carried. I started my life in the slums of Busan with a broken bottle and a lead pipe. I think I can manage a trigger. This isn't a street fight, Elara warned, her gaze pinning him to the spot. This is a liquidation. If you hesitate, if you try to negotiate, or if you look for mercy in their eyes, you're a dead man. Out there, the city is a no-man's land. There are no civilians, no laws, and no council. There is only us and the people who want to put us in the ground. She began to paint her face with dull, matte black grease, breaking up the contours of her features until she looked like a phantom born of the warehouse shadows. As she tightened the straps of her combat boots, the transformation was complete. The Special Forces past wasn't a memory anymore. It was the present. Musuk watched her, realizing that the power dynamic had finally irrevocably shifted. In the Gilded Lily, he was the sovereign. In the shipyard they were equals. But here in the cold light of the cache, she was the commander, and he was the recruit. Why help me? He asked suddenly. You have the gear. You have the skills. You could have vanished an hour ago and left me to the janitors. Why stay? Elara stopped, her hand resting on the grip of her carbine. She looked at him and for a fleeting second, a ghost of the waitress returned. A flicker of the woman who believed in something more than just survival. Because they took my piece, she said quietly. And because you're the first person in 10 years who looked at the waitress and actually saw the woman behind the mask. Even if it was only because I was holding a knife to someone's throat. She stood up, checking the seal on a smoke canister. Check your mags. We move in 3 minutes. We're not running anymore, Jang. We're going to find your shipyard. We're going to find Ji-hoon. And we're going to end this. Musuk nodded, a grim lethal smile touching his lips. He checked his weapon, mimicking her discipline. He was no longer the chairman of the White Tiger Syndicate. He was a man with a gun, standing beside a shadow that knew how to kill. To the shipyard then, he said. To the end, Elara corrected. She killed the light, plunging them into a darkness that felt like home. The rain had turned into a torrential assault by the time they reached the perimeter of the North Brooklyn docks. The shipyard was a sprawling labyrinth of steel and salt air, illuminated by the harsh sweeping beams of security towers. This was the heart of the White Tiger Syndicate's operations, the gateway through which Musuk's empire flowed. Now it was a fortress held by a usurper. Elara crouched behind the rusted chassis of a derelict crane, her breath coming in slow, disciplined cycles. She didn't look at the guards patrolling the catwalks. She looked at the gaps between their sweeps. Beside her, Musuk was a shadow in the dark, his grip white-knuckled on the handgun she had given him. 6 men on the outer perimeter, Elara whispered, her voice barely audible over the crashing surf. 3 snipers on the crane housings. Ji-hoon will be in the central office, the one with the reinforced glass. He thinks he is safe behind his walls, Musuk hissed, the rain slicking his hair back from his forehead. He thinks the storm will keep us away. The storm is our cover, Alara replied. She pulled a handheld detonator from her tactical vest. I've spent the last 20 minutes rigging the fuel lines on the South Pier. When that goes, the snipers will turn their glass toward the fire. That's our window. For minutes to cross the kill zone. If we're still in the open at 401, we're done. She didn't wait for a nod. She pressed the button. A muffled thump was followed a heartbeat later by a roaring pillar of orange flame that tore through the rainy darkness on the far side of the yard. The secondary explosions rattled the shipping containers like thunder. As the sirens began to wail and the searchlight swung wildly toward the inferno, Alara moved. She didn't run, she flowed. She was a blur of matte black and suppressed muzzle flashes. As the first guard turned toward the noise, Alara's carbine barked twice. Subsonic rounds that sounded like heavy raindrops hitting metal. The man collapsed before his radio could crackle. Musuk followed her lead. His movements less refined but driven by a savage, desperate energy. They moved through the stacks, the narrow canyons of multicolored shipping containers. It was a three-dimensional chessboard, and Alara was playing 5 moves ahead. She used a flashbang to blind a 3-man fire team emerging from a warehouse, then moved through the smoke with surgical efficiency. She wasn't fighting for territory. She was clearing a path for the man behind her. Left. 2 o'clock. Musuk shouted. He fired, his shots loud and unsuppressed, catching a gunman who had appeared on a gantry above them. The man tumbled into the dark water below. Alara glanced back, a momentary spark of approval in her eyes. The chairman was learning. He wasn't waiting for permission anymore. He was claiming his ground. They reached the base of the central office, a modular structure perched atop a stack of heavy-duty containers. The only way up was a narrow steel staircase, a bottleneck designed for a massacre. They know we're here now, Alara said, swapping a fresh magazine into her carbine. The fire on the South Pier was dying down, and the searchlights were beginning to crawl back toward their position. The janitors will be converging. I'll hold the stairs. You go for Ji-hoon. Musuk paused, his eyes searching hers through the grime and the rain. You are taking the brunt of the fire. Why? Because you need to look him in the eye, Jang, she said, her expression as hard as the steel around them. And because I'm better at holding a line than you are. Go. Now. As Musuk charged up the stairs, the yard erupted. The professional janitor squad had finally arrived, moving in a disciplined wedge formation from the main gate. Alara stepped into the open, silhouetted by the dying embers of the pier fire. She planted her feet and became a localized hurricane of lead. She worked the carbine with a rhythmic, terrifying precision. Every time a muzzle flash appeared in the dark, she extinguished it. She used the environment as a weapon, ricocheting shots off the metal containers to flush out shooters and dropping heavy pallets with well-placed rounds. She was a soldier again, a phantom of the Shadow Division, holding a private dock in Brooklyn as if it were the last hill in the world. Above her, the sound of glass shattering and a roar of rage signaled that Musuk had breached the office. Bullets sparked off the container she was using for cover, one grazing her thigh, but Alara didn't flinch. She felt the familiar, cold clarity of the red zone. A state where time slowed and every heartbeat was a tactical calculation. She was out of grenades. Her primary weapon was running hot. But she stood her ground, a lone waitress turned titan, standing between a fallen king and the army that wanted his head. Come on then, she yelled into the wind, her voice a defiant shriek against the storm. She saw the laser sights of the janitor snipers beginning to dance across her chest. She had seconds left. She pulled her last smoke canister, popped the pin, and vanished into a gray cloud just as the world around her turned into a hail of high-caliber fire. She had led the assault. She had broken the gate. Now she just had to survive the victory. The reinforced glass of the command office didn't just break. It exploded under the weight of Musuk's fury. He burst through the shards like a ghost of the empire Ji-hoon thought he had buried. Inside, the room was bathed in the rhythmic, crimson pulse of emergency lighting. Ji-hoon stood behind the heavy oak desk, the very desk where Musuk had once taught him the geography of power. The lieutenant didn't reach for his gun. He looked at Musuk with a weary, tragic recognition. "You were always too stubborn to die, Chairman. It was your greatest strength. Now, it's just an inconvenience." "Strength is not measured by survival, Ji-hoon," Musuk growled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to shake the floorboards. He tossed his empty handgun aside, his fists clenching until his knuckles turned white. "It is measured by loyalty. And you are a very weak man." Ji-hoon let out a short, jagged laugh and stepped around the desk, shedding his tactical vest. "Loyalty is a fairy tale we tell the foot soldiers, so they don't notice we're eating their portions. The council offered me a world where I don't have to live in your shadow. I took it." They collided in the center of the room with the force of two freight trains. It wasn't the choreographed dance of a movie. It was a desperate, ugly struggle of muscle and bone. Ji-hoon was younger, faster, but Musuk fought with the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose. They crashed into the walls, shattering framed maps of the shipping routes they had built together. Ji-hoon drove a knee into Musuk's ribs, a sickening crack echoing in the small space, but the chairman didn't flinch. He wrapped his massive arms around his former brother, lifting him off the floor and slamming him through a glass display case. Outside, beneath the office, the world was a symphony of violence. Alara was pinned behind a stack of rusted iron beams. The tactical squad, the janitors, had her boxed in. They were moving with L-shaped flanking maneuvers, the kind of professional discipline that usually left no survivors. Her shoulder was burning where a fragment had sliced the skin, and the blood was beginning to make the grip of her sidearm slick. She checked her last magazine. 7 rounds. She breathed in the smell of cordite and salt, her mind entering a state of hyper-focused stillness. She knew their rhythm. She counted the gap between their suppressive fire. 3 seconds for the reload. 2 for the advance. 1, 2, 3. Alara pivoted, low to the ground. She fired twice, the rounds finding the gap in the lead janitor's ballistic neck protection. She didn't stay to watch him fall. She rolled through the mud, emerging behind a heavy forklift. A flashbang detonated 5 feet to her left, ringing her ears and turning the world into a blur of white light. But her muscle memory held. She fired blindly toward the sound of boots, rewarded by a grunt of pain. She was a ghost in the machine, a shadow that bit back. But she was running out of shadows. Back in the office, Musuk had Ji-hoon pinned against the rain-slicked window. The glass groaned under their combined weight. Ji-hoon's hands were locked around Musuk's throat, his face contorted with the effort to extinguish the life of his mentor. "The world has moved on from you," Ji-hoon wheezed, his thumbs pressing into Musuk's windpipe. Musuk's vision began to gray at the edges. He looked past Ji-hoon, down at the shipyard where Alara was fighting a war she didn't owe him. He saw a muzzle flash from her position, a lone spark against a wall of darkness. He realized then that he wasn't fighting for a throne anymore. He was fighting for the only person who had ever seen him as a man instead of a monument. With a roar of primal defiance, Musuk found a sudden explosive reserve of strength. He grabbed Ji-hoon's head and slammed his forehead into the lieutenant's nose with a brutal wet thud. As Ji-hoon's grip loosened, Musuk didn't stop. He drove him back through the already weakened window. They plummeted together, crashing through a canvas awning and hitting the wet concrete of the docks 15 feet below. Musuk landed hard, the air driven from his lungs. He rolled, gasping, as Ji-hoon scrambled for a fallen combat knife near the edge of the pier. The lieutenant's face was a mask of blood, his eyes wide with a desperate, animalistic terror. He lunged, the blade whistling through the air. Musuk caught his wrist. The two men stayed locked in a grim silhouette against the burning pier in the distance. "I loved you like a son," Musuk whispered, his voice breaking. "Then you should have stepped aside," Ji-hoon spat. Musuk twisted. A sharp, definitive snap echoed over the sound of the rain. The knife clattered to the ground. With a final heavy shove, Musuk sent his lieutenant backward, over the edge of the pier and into the churning, black abyss of the Atlantic. There was no splash, only the cold silence of the water swallowing another secret. Musuk collapsed onto his knees, his head hanging low. He waited for the end, for the janitors to move in and finish what Ji-hoon couldn't. Instead, the gunfire stopped. He looked up through the haze of rain and saw a lone figure walking toward him through the smoke. Her white waitress shirt was shredded and soaked in red, her tactical vest riddled with pockmarks. Elara Brooks looked less like a woman and more like a ruin of war. She was limping, her carbine hanging empty at her side, but her eyes were still fixed on the perimeter. She reached him and stopped, her chest heaving. She looked at the empty spot on the pier, then down at the chairman. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't offer a platitude. "The squad is down," she said, her voice raspy and thin. "But the extraction team is 10 minutes out. And they aren't ours." Musuk looked at her, truly seeing the cost of his survival written in the blood on her face. "You stayed." "I finish my shifts, Jang," she replied, a ghost of a smile touching her lips before she winced in pain. "But the restaurant is closed. We need to move." She finally reached down, her hand calloused and steady. Musuk took it. As she pulled him to his feet, the hierarchy of the Gilded Lily was gone forever. There was no boss. There was no servant. There were only two survivors standing in the wreckage of a world that had tried to break them. The sirens in the distance were no longer the frantic screams of a city in chaos. They were the somber, rhythmic wails of an aftermath. Blue and red lights reflected off the oil-slicked puddles of the shipyard, painting the rusted shipping containers in the colors of a funeral. The storm had broken, leaving behind a cold, biting mist that clung to the skin like a shroud. Musuk stood by the edge of the pier, his gaze fixed on the black water where his past had finally sunk. He looked older, the lines on his face etched deeper by the night's betrayals, but the slump in his shoulders was gone. He was a man who had been hollowed out and filled back up with a different kind of iron. Elara stood 10 paces behind him, leaning against a stack of timber. She had stripped away the tactical vest, leaving only the tattered, blood-stained remnants of her white shirt. She was cleaning a shallow gash on her cheek with a piece of gauze, her movements slow and mechanical. The soldier was receding, leaving behind a woman who looked profoundly, devastatingly tired. "The council is in disarray," Musuk said, his voice carrying over the lapping waves. "Ji-hoon's death and the failure of the janitors has left a vacuum. By sunrise, the loyalists will have regained the headquarters. My empire is mine again." He turned to face her. The dawn light was just beginning to gray the horizon, catching the silver in his hair. "I am going back, Elara. Not as a god pretending to be a man, but as a king who knows exactly where the knives are hidden." He walked toward her, stopping just outside her personal space. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a silk handkerchief. He held it out to her. It was a signet ring, the heavy gold seal of the White Tiger Syndicate. "I have a seat at my table that has been empty for a long time," he said, his voice dropping to a respectful murmur. "Not as a waitress, not as a guard, but as a partner. You saved the tiger, now help him rule. You will never have to hide in a motel or carry a go-bag again. You will be untouchable." Elara looked at the ring, then up at the man offering it. For a heartbeat, the vision of a life without fear flickered in her mind. A life where she was the one holding the power, where no one could ever hunt her again. But as she looked at Musuk, she didn't see a throne. She saw a target. She saw the cycle of blood and brass that had defined her life since she was 18 years old. She reached out, but instead of taking the ring, she gently pushed his hand back toward his chest. "I've spent my life being a weapon for other people's wars, Jang," she said, her voice soft but final. "If I sit at that table, I'm just a different kind of tool. I didn't save you so I could become a queen. I saved you because I wanted to remember what it felt like to choose for myself." Musuk's expression didn't harden, it softened. He closed his hand over the ring and nodded slowly. He understood. A bird that had fought so hard to break its cage wasn't going to fly into a golden one. "Then what will you do?" he asked. "The division, the janitors. They know you're alive. You are a ghost with a heartbeat, Alara. They won't stop looking. Let them look, she said, a small dangerous spark returning to her eyes. I'm good at disappearing, but I'm tired of being broke while I do it. She looked at the luxury sedan idling at the gate, one of the few syndicate vehicles that had arrived with the loyalist cleanup crew. You want to thank me? Don't give me a seat at the table. Give me the table's resources. I'll stay in the shadows, but I want the tiger at my back. If I need a flight, if I need a name changed, if I need a city to go quiet while I pass through it, I want you to be the one to make it happen. A slow, genuine smile spread across Musuk's face. It was the smile of a predator recognizing its own kind. A silent partnership. You disappear, but I remain your anchor in the world. And if someone comes for you again, Alara added, someone you can't see in the mirrors, you'll have a number that doesn't exist. I won't be your servant, Jang, but I'll be your shadow. Musuk bowed. A deep traditional gesture of respect he had never offered to another living soul. The shadow of the tiger is a dangerous place to be, Alara Brooks. But I think the world should be more afraid of you than it is of me. I hope so, she said. She picked up her bag, slinging it over her shoulder. She didn't say goodbye. She walked toward the edge of the shipyard, moving away from the lights and the sirens. As she reached the perimeter fence, she paused and looked back one last time. Musuk was standing among his men, the black-suited guards surrounding him once again, a wall of suits and steel. He looked like a god again, powerful and remote. But then he caught her eye and gave a single sharp nod. Alara turned and stepped into the alleyway. By the time the sun fully crested the skyline, the Gilded Lily was a crime scene. The white tiger was back on his throne, and a young woman in a dark hoodie was merging into the early morning crowd of the subway. She looked like everyone else. Just another face in a city of millions. A waitress. A student. A ghost. But as she touched the cold steel of the hidden blade in her sleeve, she knew the truth. She wasn't running anymore. She was just waiting for the next person to mistake her for someone who didn't matter. The most dangerous people are the ones you never notice at all. And Alara Brooks was finally perfectly invisible. If this story made you feel something, please like the video and subscribe to this channel for more.